Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicholas St. Pierre. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Agilicus. And today, in our series of Platform Showcase, we'll be demonstrating how we can master vendor access management, dealing with identities, privileges, and resources across all type of industries, both in the IT and the OT space. So welcome, wherever you are. What we'll cover today is industrial control systems automation, building access, anything that may be IT or OT related. We will look at what is zero trust in both OT and the IT space. We'll talk about Agilicus itself and how we deal with identity federation and how we integrate this into our NEX platform. I'll talk about what are permissions from the best approach to like the least amount of privileges, for example, how we deal with separate and individual resources that we can assign to people, and how these people are represented by their identity, things they know, and multi-factor, or things they have. We'll look how we can tie all of these objects together and have security policies that are very flexible and tailored to both the type of identities that we put into our system, the organization that these identities are tied to, think vendor, contractor, personal accounts, for example, and the types of resource and the level of permissions that we assign to those. Lastly, I'll do a quick demo. We'll see the tail of the three necks. I don't know who these three people are. They're likely me, but we'll see the level of permissions and the roles and the access that they have based on who they are and where they come from and the resources they need to access. So let's get on with it and let's look at what is zero trust in IT and in OT or operational technology and what this means for our platform. So here at Agilicus in our NEX platform, we deal with zero trust, the overarching principle, with three questions that we always ask about giving remote access to people or organizations within a system that might be driven by IT administration or into an industrial control systems where we have different OT zones. The first question is who you are. Who is the person, sometimes the machine, that we need to individually know about, authenticate, verify their identity if need be, and where that person fits within the amount of resources that we are going to make available and what level we're going to make available to them. And that's the what, right? What is the permission now that we have a valid identity that we are going to assign to individual resources within our organization? Think a desktop, a file share, an HVAC system, maybe a panel, an alarm panel, maybe a water control system, an HMI, or something as simple as a VNC screen, for example. So we'll look at that as well. So what is the identity of that user? What is the amount of privileges that we need to assign to that session so that the user can accomplish their work and no more? And finally, we'll look at how do we route in a zero trust architecture so that we are secure end-to-end, we maintain privacy, we maintain end-to-end encryption, and we get to the destination regardless of the network access or the network conditions that are at the far end within our, for example, industrial setting or into a building. I may have systems that are not connected to the internet where I can maintain an air gap. I may have systems that have multiple resources on them and I don't want my users to traverse east-west, for example. So we'll look at that in our demo with the three NICs and see how we can differentiate the level of access and really tailor an individual access profile for each user. So let's talk a little bit about user federation because obviously it's a better way of dealing with identity. It's one where we have a lot of flexibility, and it's one that we sort of differentiate from your traditional username and password credential. So let's think about identity as each person. Each person signs in. We're used to having multiple accounts sometimes, and traditionally giving access to either an employee for VPN, for example, a traditional VPN account, or maybe a contractor where we dedicate a shared account within a desktop or a resource internally in our system, or sometimes a machine. Or sometimes we need to provision these extra credentials. So we have a process, what I call an undo process or toil of adding these extra credentials following the workflow of enabling and disabling these credentials when access is needed by a user and when access is no longer needed because the work or the contract is done. In Zero Trust with Federation, we rely on existing identity providers. So first of all, we're not going to require the creation of new identities. We're going to use exactly the ones that exist within an organization, a third-party vendor, a contractor, a personal individual, for example, by integrating with existing providers. Those could be, for example, Microsoft with Office 365 or Azure AD. It could be the Google G Suite, for example, if I have a corporate organization such as Agilicus, leveraging the G Suite platform. I will look at what are the types of factors or multi-factor that I can enable that aren't shared amongst individual or organization that are tied to the user. I talk about who you are and what you know and what you have. And this is the principle of multi-factor. I may have an existing account with an existing identity provider, but I may also have a security key, for example, in the form of a USB YubiKey. I may have a time-sensitive one-time password, or I may have a device, my Android phone, for example, to which I've tied an identity and a way to verify who I am by unlocking the phone. This can work regardless of employers. This can work across employers. This can work regardless of whether or not I have what's called an IDP or an identity provider. I can use a personal Google account. I could use a corporate Google account or a corporate Office 365 account. I get to choose here in my authorization rules the level of scrutiny I'm going to give each an individual identity provider. The scenario would be that Nick, the contractor, for example, does not have a company, works under his personal name, uses his Hotmail account, and therefore I'm going to insist on having multi-factor authentication across all resources within my organization that I am going to make available to him, simply because he uses a personal email account. I can create this distinction of access on a per resource basis, per user, for example, whether I'm using my personal account or my corporate account. I can even do so based on time of day. I will only allow a contractor based on the length of that contract, or even for a specific resource based on the length of time required to that resource. So let's think, for example, a maintenance window that needs to happen between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. I could restrict access there to that resource. Ideally, all of this is very important and useful, but having the ability to audit, the ability to maintain our governance, risk management, and compliance becomes really essential here. So the ability to stream these records of who's accessing what and when and under what privilege with which two-factor authentication, for example, method they use is very useful. We can then start to see the elevation in a zero trust model that distinguishes it from, for example, a traditional VPN, where we would use a username and a password as a credential. Maybe we provision a new one on top of it. And then we get to realize that VPNs, by their network features, or the layer at which they operate, tie themselves to IP networks. So we're linking a home network, for example, to a corporate network. We may be developing advanced access control lists to prevent traversals, but we're still merging networks together at that layer where we're dependent on IP addressing and routes, and then we can come up with a little bit more advanced systems like split tunneling or pushing routes. But we end up with a model where different sites in our organization that may have overlapping internal IPs, think different offices or different branch offices, are no longer routable amongst each other because they have overlapping IP space, and Zero Trust fixes that. In any case, the important thing from a security posture management here, and then we'll look at the architecture and topology, is I should not have to sacrifice both my security rules and my security posture, aka the default rules that apply to my networking equipment from a security first perspective, in order to enable this. I should not have to provision new VPN or even provision DMZ, for example, devices. And more importantly, I should not have to map individual inbound ports for each individual new resource that I add to my platform for third parties or employees or contractors to reach. So let's get into it. Let's look at what unified identity looks like. Overall, we want the identity experience to be seamless. We want our users to adopt our privacy-first approach in the NEX platform using the federated identity I just discussed. Users either using, for example, a personal email account that we see Nick the contractor here logging in with a Hotmail account should sign in the same way as an employee, for example, by using their own identity, by not having our IT group within the organization supply either new credentials, having to assign new Active Directory licenses or seats, and so on. I should be able to do MFA or multi-factor authentication across all types of resources, even legacy applications that are web-based, across things that I may not otherwise have MFA capability like RDP or VNC, for example, or even a web interface or a thick client. Ultimately, I get to decide whether I'm going to provide single sign-on, whether I'm going to allow a BYOD or bring your own device, depending on the identity or the organization that these persons belong to. So all of it then gets merged into the unified identity system of the platform. On the far end of our resources, like I mentioned with security posture, for example, we want to be very cognizant of the toil required to make new resources available for internal employees, third parties, and contractors. So I don't want to sacrifice my security posture at the firewall. I want to always use the same methodology, and the NEX device, the connector in this case that we deploy within the secure network, only ever connects once, only through an outbound connection, so there is no exceptions to be made to our firewall. Most commercial grade prosumer or even personal firewall devices allow outbound connectivity over TLS to the internet. In this case, we can further secure that connection to only allow it to the NEX platform and its IP address space. We then want to have the ability, without convoluted access control lists at the IP layer, of enforcing privileged access with the least amount of permissions. That can be impossible to do sometimes at the IP layer because we're talking about transactional application layer permissions here. The Agillicus NEX platform has an understanding of what we call first-class application, things like file shares, remote desktop, both of the RDP and VNC nature, web application, where we can define a web application firewall and protect against the top 10 OWASP, for example, security applications. But most of all, it also allows us to keep all of these applications on our secure network off the public internet. These devices do not need internet access if they don't have to. As long as the local connector has IP reachability to these devices, we can maintain these devices off the internet, air-gapped, and still provide access to them. Should they be compromised, we have full resource segmentation in the first step. They don't have internet access, therefore they cannot download, for example, malicious payload to execute. And then we maintain enhanced security profiles, for example, that could be mandated by organizations such as EPA or recommended by other organizations such as ISA and NIST. So we maintain our compliance. So let's look at how we pair all of this together. We want to be able to assign resources and privileges to identities by crafting security policies that are very simple, that identify the role or groups and the resources they access. So the first one is where we're going to pair resources with identity. So I am not going to issue new credentials for these identities. I'm going to allow my employees, my contractors, my vendors to use their existing credentials, their existing identity provider. That way, the security policy is easily adopted because it's the existing one of their organization. If Acme or XYZ company has a manufacturer or as a vendor has its own Office 365 policy of MFA, they get to preserve that. It will not be new to them. It will be completely second nature. It'll be their traditional login mechanisms and dialogues that they will see. We're going to use those identities once they're verified to define the access that we are going to grant to these devices. So importantly, we're not going to manage these identities. We're not going to manage their credentials. We're not going to manage their passwords. We are going to allow across all types of organization access to all types of resources, whether they are like resources. Desktops, for example, or group of file shares are completely differentiated resources. A web app, an industrial control system like an HVAC, HMI, it could be a VNC desktop, for example. What I'm then going to do once I have paired resources with identity, I'm going to pair my security policy with the identity provider. This can be very useful now because I can deal with the identity of the organizations and use that to dictate completely separate identity policies. I can choose which vendor I will allow to do MFA and which type of multi-factor authentication I'm going to allow from them. I'm also going to decide which organization or which identity provider I'm going to allow to do single sign-on across all types of resources on my network. In this case, I may choose to not allow single sign-on for someone using a personal email account, seeing that it could maybe be easily compromised by family members or carelessness. I'm going to choose how long I allow these sessions to live on, and when I choose to re-authenticate or force them to provide a new two-factor authentication. This can be very useful in organizations where vendors come into my network and I have no control over their own organizational use of MFA. For example, I may choose to not trust SMS or text-based two-factor authentication and therefore will require either the one-time password that's time-sensitive or a web device or a BYOD, for example, a device-based two-factor authentication. So we get to decide whether or not we trust third-party organizations' own multi-factor authentication. Finally, I'm going to tie up all the privileges of the existing resources. I'm going to be able to do application-level privileges, not just network-based. And then I'm going to be able to differentiate the entire scenario and experience from a security portfolio of my employees, my vendors, my contractors, or any other person that's able to identify themselves through the NEX platform. This could lead to certain roles being able to access a wide range of resources that I'll show you, for example, such as a VNC desktop or an industrial application like VT-SCADA, or a web interface like an HMI or an HVAC system, or even just a ticket filing system. That way, I have now paired privileges at the application layer to an identity. I have paired policy or security policies to the organization where that identity belongs. And now I've also paired the types of resources that I'm going to allow. So I have done the who, the what, and the how. When we get into the zero trust model, the who, the what, and the how is very important. It's the questions that need to be asked repeatedly. Who is this person? What organization they come from? Which two-factor authentication method am I going to require, if any? And how I'm going to accept the session time or the length of their session based on who they are. The second one is what. What is the level of privileges, like I mentioned, at the application layer that I'm going to allow in order to let them accomplish their task? So I need to define from an application layer, do they need read-write, read-only? But also from a network layer, what is the east-west blast radius I'm going to allow for each of these resources? Am I locking it down to a specific PLC, a specific web interface, a specific SQL server, for example? And then I'm going to do how. How do I route to this device? Is this device air-gapped? How do I get to this via the NEX connector and authorize that session within the secured network? So let's look at what that platform showcase looks like. I'll have three identities. We'll look at them and their scenarios and who they are, the three NICs, and they come in through the identity provider. First verify their identity. For example, today we'll look at Microsoft, could be Office 365, could be Outlook. We'll look at G Suite, Gmail, personal accounts, but corporate accounts as well. And once we've verified their identity into the Agillicus NEX portal in the center, we'll look at the resources that have been assigned to these roles and these identities. And then we'll be able to reach inside of the secure network at the facility and access individual components and see where different roles and permission applied. Everyone has a different view, but everyone has the same experience using the platform. So first I'll try and demonstrate, for example, an employee coming in with their corporate identity and getting access to resources. I'll then go with something like a vendor role, where the vendor uses still either a Gmail account or a G Suite account, but has a different view and more restricted level of access to only their equipment, where they have more permissions and maybe they have access to a dashboard that's internal to the secure facility, but they don't have, for example, full access. There's a web application firewall in the way. So let's look at what that is, and let's go a little bit further. So let's look at the three roles that we have today. So the first one, let's call him Nick, the employee. Nick works for the organization where the resources are located. He's got high-level permissions internally on the network when he's at work. His IDP or identity provider is the organization's own, let's say Office 365 or Google G Suite, and it is trusted. And because he's an employee, he's got, let's call it BYOD, or he's brought his own device. So we will allow him to first use the multi-factor authentication that's embedded in his G Suite corporate account, but we'll also allow him to use different types of multi-factor authentication that will be permissive for each individual resource when he seeks to access them. We'll allow him the time-sensitive one-time password. We'll also allow him to use his hardware device, for example, his phone, his personal phone, where he has that G Suite account open. Let's look at the second role here. Let's call him Nick the vendor. Nick the vendor does not work for the organization, but his company has sold equipment into that organization, and he's responsible to do remote access. He's previously done truck rolls, being fairly costly to just move, or with the displacement to go on site and access the device that he would much rather use remotely. His VPN access has been disabled for security reason. The company organization no longer wants to do VPN because there's been previously lateral action with malicious device or compromised devices across the network. We'll give him basic access to VNC for his equipment, where he will be able to do the work and interact with the full desktop. We don't necessarily understand well what his identity provider of his organization uses. We know it's G Suite, but we know that he uses MFA, but we're not sure what level of multi-factor authentication, how often it's being asked for by his identity provider. And we know that he uses a personal Gmail account. So therefore, we will enforce MFA and we'll get him to use one-time password. And lastly, let's look at Nick, the contractor. Nick, the contractor, has a very important job on legacy hardware equipment within the organization. Nick is self-employed. Nick does not have an IDP or an identity provider. In fact, Nick is pretty old school. He uses his Hotmail account. So we're going to identify Nick, the contractor, via his Microsoft Hotmail login. We will enforce his MFA with a one-time password because we don't know what type of devices he has otherwise, for example, for his phone. So we'll use Google or Microsoft Authenticator. And we will enforce the fact that Nick needs to use multi-factor authentication whenever he accesses the resource, and we'll limit the amount of privileges that he can have on these resources. So if you want to look at this, let's go and see what that looks like. I'm going to share now a desktop. So we're going to travel out of this presentation and we are going to look at the presentation here by sharing a screen in a moment, and I will share this window here. So now we should be looking at an incognito Chrome, and I'll have my assistant Drew give me the thumbs up that we can actually see this. And when we do, what we'll see is that I will log into a profile. So let's go for it. I have a test organization called egov.city. This is an end user portal that allows me to view the resources that are assigned to me. It's optional in the Agillicus NEX platform because I can access resources directly, but it's a nice way of seeing all of the organization's resources assigned to me, and it's nicely themed. It represents the branding of my organization, and I get to choose the identity providers that the users is going to be able to use. Here we see I could use an Apple identification. I could use a Google, either personal or G Suite based. I can even use a Microsoft identity, whether Office 365, Azure AD, or even like in this case, Skype or Outlook. I also have the ability to configure a flexible identity providers that could authenticate against a completely federated Active Directory, a local Windows machine, or local Linux machine, for example, an ERP system. So I could have third-party contractors authenticate themselves via their payroll system. I have the ability here to choose every account every time I log in. I'm going to sign in with my Agilicus credentials right now. So let's look at Nick, the employee, and it's nick@agilicus.com, which is G Suite. I notice here that this dialog is entirely taken over by Google. Google is going to verify my identity. When I log in here, I need to log in with my password. Let's see if I remember it. It looks like I do. And you see here I have full two-step verification with G Suite. My phone is asking me if this is me logging in here from the Office geography. I say, yes, it's me. Now Google has done its login. It is passing back the validity of my session and my identity to Agilicus. Now, in order to reach this resource, Agilicus now is asking for a full multi-factor authentication. And like I mentioned, I trust the device that Nicholas is on, the employee. So I'm allowing to use either his Google or Microsoft Authenticator with the one-time password that's time-based, or even with the biometric or security key. Here in my profile in Google G Suite, my phone is registered. So now my phone is beeping and asking me if I want to log in. In order to do so, it's asking me to unlock my phone. So now we all are waiting on the Android feedback that my phone has been unlocked properly. And now that it's done, I am able to access my profile. In my profile, I clearly see here in the top right corner who I am. It's Nick at Agilicus. I have a slew of devices that I can access. Let's look, for example, as an HMI operation. Now in this HMI, I will actually be, because of the sensitive nature of this resource, asked to authenticate again, specifically through my identity provider. So I'm going to go back here, and you'll notice here when I choose Nick at Agilicus, I'm no longer asked to provide the two-factor from Google because I've already signed in and I have a valid session in my browser. My MFA has been accepted once previously by Agilicus, and because I'm an employee, I am trusting this two-factor authentication for a length of time that I fall under, and I have now access to a full dashboard that could be completely air-gapped within my secure facility. I can interact with it and I can click on it. I have full permission. If I choose, for example, to look at another resource, in this case, let's look at a VNC desktop. I may be given full access to this desktop where I have important project diagrams, for example, that I need to load, and I can interact with this desktop. Notice that all of this is web-based. I could choose to have my native clients, but in this case, it's very easy, very seamless that from the interface, I can reach this VNC. Same is true for the HMI. I could reach it directly. So now I have the first role. Nick, the employee, has full access or full dominion over his kingdom and can access the profile. I can choose to log out of these devices by tracking where the logout is on these HMIs, for example, and be prompted back out into this interface. So when I look at this resource, for example, now I can decide to sign out completely and log out of my device. Let's look at Nick, the vendor. So we argued that Nick the vendor is a little bit different. He's a known vendor for the company. He's got his equipment. I'm going to sign in this time with a Gmail account. So here we remember Google still remembers that I've used a different identity previously of Nick, the employee. Here I'm going to use my, let's say, my vendor account, which is my Google Gmail account. And I'm going to log in. Oh, pardon me. There we go. So now my Google account is secured with two-factor, and I have a different set of capabilities from two-factor. I can just choose to say yes on my phone, for example, and then my phone is telling me, is this you again? And say yes. Now we realize that the multi-factor here is still required to enter into the profile, and we see here that I am not accepting the one-time password. I will accept the phone WebAuthn hardware device. My phone is now asking me again, no, Nick at vendor, please unlock your phone so I can let you in. Now we see the level of applications is switched differently. I have access to my own SCADA system. I have access to a desktop, maybe with lower privileges. I may have access to some shares or not. But what I do see here is that the application levels has changed. I don't have access to that previous HMI. I have been granted access and a level of permissions to these devices based on my identity. So I can do so again here for the sake of the demo, re-authenticate myself. Google's not going to ask me for my two-factor again. My MFA from Agilicus is still valid. You see the slight difference in behavior here, and I'm accessing now a VDSCADA demo. So now I have seamless access because I have a trusted identity and a trusted identity provider. I can access the VDSCADA here and have reduced the amount of privileges by being unable to click anywhere on this interface as well. Let's look now at our third user. So we have a little kitty cat here, and we'll log it out, and we will log out of this SCADA demo as well. And what we will do now is log in with our third persona, Nick, the contractor. So when Nick logs in, this time he will log in with his Hotmail account. So we're going to choose Microsoft here. And we'll see here if I'm going to use an old Microsoft account, Hotmail, and I'm going to be asked to log in with a password. Let's say no. So now I have not used MFA here with my identity provider. It's a fairly old account. I'm not going to trust the hardware device or biometric or its phone because I don't know where it's been. I'm going to require a one-time password through either Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator. In this case here, I'm just going to type in my one-time password. Now we see we truly have Nick here at hotmail.com. Nick has only access to the HMI. That's the only thing he can access and needs to, again, do is log in order to access it. Notice this is because the resource is accessible directly without that portal. And there we are, because I'm already logged in. Nick has some level of access to this, but he can only really view this. There's a web application firewall that prevents me from clicking anywhere in this purview where the vendor had different access. So Nick can be on call to monitor this, but cannot change any of the settings in that interface by virtue of the web application firewall, granting him different HTTP security policies because of his identity. Nick could have a desktop as well, but nothing else, where he cannot click on any of these icons, but can you view someone else interacting? So I could do screen sharing or through a shared session where someone else is driving the mouse or cursor, but he can observe the activity of that person. So now I've used 3 different identities, each with a different identity provider, each with a different level of trust that I have in this organization and identity provider by marrying different requirements from a two-factor authentication, the length of the accepted session, for example, not having to re-log in across devices, for example, if I use Google, G Suite, or Gmail, and the ability to really separate the amount of privileges I have at the application layer for every single resource. So I can log out of here, for example, and be directed back to the profile. I can access these resources directly also, for example. So if I log out, I can go back to my hmi.cloud.egov.city and be prompted again for the privileges. So we're just going to leave that demo now and go back to our slide and see what is it that we just saw. Ideally, what I've been able to demonstrate to you is I've used, again, 3 different identities. I have a corporate identity provider, for example, with Google G Suite for Agillicus. I've used the same G Suite but personal account with Gmail to play the role of the vendor. And then I have the role of the contractor that does not have a dedicated identity provider, leverages a legacy system, for example, here, Hotmail account, but through Microsoft that has some level of security. And then on it, I have layered multi-factor authentication. I have separated the level of permissions that I've granted to each of these identities with different resource types, for example, desktop versus web interface or an HMI or a control system. I've separated the privilege that they have on each of these types of resource. I've allowed the HMI through the web application firewall to be completely interactive as it is locally, or in an observation only mode where I'm blocking interaction or clicking around the interface. I can do the same with other applications that support roles, for example, like VNC, where I've selected the contractor to only be able to view that screen and not be able to move the cursor and disrupt the dialogue while someone else is using the desktop. In this case, the vendor could be using the desktop and the contractor could be observing, each having different roles that basically negates the war over that mouse cursor. If you have any questions on this platform showcase today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is nick@Agillicus. I'm Nicholas St. Pierre, Chief Technology Officer here at Agillicus. If you would like a demo of the platform, we offer a free test drive of the NEX platform. You can contact us at info@agillicus.com, and we'd be very happy to duplicate these types of platform showcase, for example, in your environment and show you the flexibility of the platform. Again, thank you very much.